Hey, Grampion Nation, most of you know that I am a baby boomer, a proud one at that. And I'd like to think I have an open mind. And after me comes Gen X, and then after that comes Millennials. And I'd like to think I understand them. And I met one I really kind of like. So keep an open mind, hang on, and join me as we talk to Josh Lewis. Hang on.
In 2013, I coined the name Grampion, and I gave it to your host, Jim Tracy.
Hey, Grampion Nation, welcome back. Today we have Josh Lewis, who is a CPA for those younger generations. That's a certified public accountant. He's from Tulsa, hails from Tulsa, Oklahoma, and he works for the Oklahoma State Auditor's Office, and he is the guy who checks and balances and keeps our government running, hopefully, efficiently. But he has a unique perspective and a practical one as an outside observer of the body politic. He writes a blog, which, I mean, if you connect blog and millennial, we have an enigma already. Josh, welcome to the Grampion, man. How are you?
I'm doing great. I hope we've not already alienated half your audience.
Well, if we have, when we probably alienated the right half. So we'll just keep going. Yeah, we don't really have a political podcast, but we are free to express opinions here. And the reason I contacted you is I saw the name of your blog, and it's called Saving Elephants. Now, I don't know where that came from, but enlighten me. I know.
That's an excellent question. It came out of, I suppose, a frustration from the original Donald Trump campaign of 2016. I had been deeply involved in the Republican Party. I've been a Republican my whole life. And prior to Trump, I was very concerned within the Republican Party. My old joke, which was only partially joking, is if I showed up to a Republican meeting, I could decrease the median age by a decade. Because it was concerning to me that there were not enough young people involved in what I, at the time, felt very strongly was the only option we had for, say, a limited government party, which is, as a classical conservative, what I was always concerned about. Why is this message not resonating with younger Americans? And it just seemed evident when I would go to these parties, like, well, it's largely populated, if you'll forgive me, by older individuals who are very public spirited, but maybe have a deaf ear to what it is younger Americans are concerned about, particularly those on the right. That sort of is where it began, but then it went to hyperdrive under Donald Trump when it looked like it was offering to us, I'll say, an alternative that in my view is very different than what I'd understood limited conservative government to have always been. There's some crossovers. I don't want to just say it's the complete antithesis of it. But it became kind of a twofold mission, if you will. One about how do we effectively, I'll use the word evangelize to younger generations, why traditional conservatism, which is not an easy fit. It's not exciting and sexy, right, in a lot of ways. Why is a healthier mold to live your life by, and not just for your politics, but your entire life? But secondly, why it is necessary the Republican Party itself be the vehicle of this sort of political package or ideology, and how we're at danger of losing that. And so a lot of what I do with Saving Elephants is I read really old, sometimes dull, thick books written by a lot of guys that died 200 years ago. And then I try to translate it in a way that's a little bit more digestible today to explain, okay, this is what traditional conservative values were about and how they might be faithfully applied today. And I try to bring on a wide range of voices that don't always agree on that, but that's part of the fun is that broader conversation and disagreement about what this might mean.
I heard a guy say one time, and I think it actually was my son. He said, "Hey, you just got to calm down a minute. Just because we disagree doesn't mean I hate you." And that really resonated with me because the message, I guess he's got another saying for his old man. He says, "Hey, just tell your face because nobody else knows right now." But is that true that we're so split now that maybe you can't find a way to unite this thing back together?
I certainly don't think it's true that we can't find a way to unite it back together, but let's just acknowledge it's difficult, right? It's anyone who has living memory of our politics over the last, say, 20 years, I think for the most part is in agreement, whether or not they agree on anything else, that things seem more divisive than what they once were. There seems to be less public spiritedness. And maybe it was always that way and we're always just sort of fooling ourselves. Maybe TikTok and Twitter has allowed us to see how ugly we really are, or maybe it's made us ugly, I don't know. But I think it's good to recognize, we've existed for now almost 250 years. there was a point at which we were literally killing each other by the hundreds of thousands during the Civil War. There was a point at which we came close to a civil war after the tumultuous, the early 1800 elections. Divisiveness in American politics is nothing new and is probably always going to be with us. It waxes and wanes. The key, I think, is we have a lot of structural problems in that, just to get to the shortcut of the conversation, I don't think Congress is effectively working. I think part of the nastiness of our politics is everything gets wedged into the executive and judicial branches rather than really where our system was intended for these fights to happen. We can have fights, we can have disagreements, but at the end of the day, we're supposed to have some sort of a functional compromise. And I don't mean by that everything needs to land in the middle. I'm a partisan. I have some very strong views. But I also recognize in a nation of 300 plus million people, it becomes necessary to have some sort of negotiations in good faith across party lines. And our Congress is effectively broken and not doing their job. There's a number of ways we could address that. But I think until that happens, it's difficult for people to see that there's any way forward.
Yeah. And we don't settle things anymore like Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton.
Thankfully.
Thankfully. So I'm gonna take a step back here. One of the things that was enamoring about you is you celebrated your graduation from the College of the Ozarks, and you called it Hardwood U. Where did you get that name?
I don't remember who the individual was. I think it was a former president that gave us that name. College of the Ozarks, Hard Work U. The name comes from the fact that all of the student body work on campus and that the students don't pay for tuition. Now, if you choose to work in the summer program, over the summer, you don't pay room and board either. I didn't do that. I came back to Tulsa, so I paid some things. Had to pay for books, some other fees. But their goal really is to try to graduate as many as possible debt-free, which is a very admirable goal. And so it necessitates that, the college itself assigns you a job and you don't get a paycheck. It's just paying off your tuition, which, to be frank, is actually a really good value.
Makes me want to hire from there, man. I had no idea. I'm completely in favor of it.
No, it's a wonderful model. It doesn't work for everyone in that it depends on a large degree on a donor base willing to see the value in this and to keep it going.
Sure.
And I think because of it carving out sort of a Christian conservative niche, if you will, and is in Branson, Missouri, I think they're able to, to put it bluntly, to bus enough wonderful senior citizens on there to say, hey, look, we're doing God's work here. Why don't we write a check for the good old College of the Ozarks? And that combination of those sorts of endowments and the students working, their overhead is very low because they don't have to hire a dining staff. They've got a student body, to do it, if you will.
Yeah.
That combination allows for this to exist. And I think it's a wonderful model because it not only instills a sense of virtue of work, but, gratefully, I graduated debt free, which is something most of my peers cannot say.
That's way cool.
Yeah.
So, as I look at the conversation we started, when we first spoke, I'm a boomer, and so born in the 1950s. Then there's this generation between you and I called Millennials, or called Gen Xers, and then there's you. But your generation is now in the 40s, man. I mean, what is it like to be a conservative millennial in today's society?
Gosh, that's a great question. I had a guest on recently on my podcast that I asked him because he was part of the American Conservation Coalition, which is a right-leaning environmental group. The first time I had a guest from their group on, they said something about millennials working for sensible environmental policy. Well, it doesn't say that anymore. Now it says younger Americans. So I just straight up asked him, when did millennials stop being shorthand for young Americans? Yeah. And in effect, I'm actually very grateful it has been. As I mentioned in the green room, I'm the geriatric end. I was born in 82, so I'm well into my 40s at this point. Right. There are some millennials that are just barely into their 30s. So we run there's a wide range there. But it did bother me for many years, not that long ago, the degree to which when older Americans complained about the kids these days, they use the term millennial. Because I'm like, look, if you have a problem with millennial, that's fine, but we're not the kids.
Yeah.
That's Gen Z. We're not the kids these days. We're the young adults
It's
in the American
alpha now,
workforce.
brother. It's alphas now.
It is the alphas now.
The
Yes,
alphas are actually getting into the workforce a little bit. So,
but typically when they would complain about the children, what they meant was some YouTube video that went sensational on a college campus about somebody that was melting down over something. And like that's a different generation. That's not us. But
we tend to create a very broad stroke with our brushes about generations. I think that one of the things that part of the benefit of being old is that my grandpa was born in 1903, and so he was part of the latest generation.
Yeah,
and then came my dad, and then me, and then my kids, and then my grandkids. And here's what I can tell you: my grandpa said about my dad that his music was jacked up, and his clothes were funny, and they had this new thing called the jitterbug and that big band stuff. It was abhorrent. And then my dad looked at our generation and said, "You hippies are all alike. You're ruining music and dance and your bell-bottom jeans. You're making me sick." And then we looked at the grunge movement and said, "Wow, their hair and their clothes and their music." And then they looked at the rappers, and pretty soon we're all the way down into every generation has treated the subsequent generation with that kind of animosity. And it's really not necessary. And I know that because I got along with every generation.
I think that's an excellent observation. And it's one that, as a conservative, as I'll say a Burkean conservative, Edmund Burke, I think he was profound in his wisdom of what he referred to as the three generations. And in effect, he said there are three generations. There have always been three generations, and there will only always be three generations. And well, what does that mean? Typically when we say generations, we have a millennial or Gen X or boom or something like that. He said, no, here are the three generations. There's you and I. We're talking to each other right now. Then there's the one behind us. Those are all the people who have died, stretching back to who knows how far back. And then in front of us are those who have yet to be born. And in effect, there's a sense in which human nature is a constant. It does not change. And probably 1,000 years from now, the older generation is going to be complaining about the entertainment and the style of the younger generation. The younger generation will be complaining about the old fogey ways of the old generation, just don't get it.
Yeah.
That being said, that does not mean that we can't, and again, this is a Burkean model. It doesn't mean any generation is necessarily right or wrong, though. There are genuine critiques older Americans could have, say, of younger Americans, that oftentimes we miss the beauty or the importance of a tradition, or we don't understand something. Typically, in my view, a generation often sees what's wrong with the previous generation and overcorrects, right? So that they sort of go, they do good things for good reasons, but then they create sort of their own problems. And that's why you get this kind of bizarre backlash oftentimes between the grandparents and grandchildren's generations that sometimes understand each other better.
The monster knee-jerk reactions to a tattoo.
Oh yeah, yeah, and so I think it's important to, as G.K. Chesterton talked about, tradition is a democracy of the dead, and I love that phrase. It's this notion that the people who are dead still get a vote. It's not just those of us who happen to be walking around. And we do that by honoring our ancestors. To be really clear, it does not mean we're stuck in the past. It just means we have some sort of deference of understanding, why did they value this? Why do they think we're so out of touch? Is there something maybe we're missing? And I think the person who can at least pay some credence to those ideas is often better off in life than an individual who just presumes that their generation is the one who had it figured out and everyone behind them or in front of them is out of touch in some manner.
Well, we have to be cognizant about it because a lot of times they train us. If I look at the people who most impacted my life, the lion's share of them, there are 4 I can name right now that were born in 1925. And they went through a pretty nasty time during World War II and delivered some of the things that are awesome and some of the things that are awful about our society today. But they trained me. And so I'm carrying that with me, and I train my kids, and they're going to carry that with them. And I'm watching them make some of the same awesome decisions and some of the mistakes that I've made.
No, that's true. And that's why I think it's I think we humans benefit from, this is again a conservative idea that there is no central authority. There's no one individual who's somehow wise enough or good enough to dictate everything. But I would stretch that even further. There's no single generation that's wise enough. It takes multi-generations, and sometimes that means literally relying on the people who aren't here anymore, trying to understand what wisdom we can gain from them, that the lessons of life don't stretch just from one generation to the next. Sometimes it takes multiple generations to truly understand how to apply wisdom, at least at a macro level.
Yeah. Al Ferguson is a guy from Port Orchard, Washington, and he's got a library that's like monstrosity. And he said, I learn more from dead guys than I do from live guys. And there's a lot of truth in that. But anyway, so you are in many ways a voice of the conservative movement. I'm going to say movement because in many ways there's been change afoot, and sometimes that change is going back to some of the roots and some of the basics of the premise that we are a free people, that we are reliant upon the limited government, or we want to be reliant on limited government. And talk to us about that. What's it like to be that voice?
Boy, that's an excellent. First of all, thank you for saying I'm that voice. It depends on how we're defining terms, obviously. I spent a lot of time trying to define, well, what is a conservative? By certain measurements, I'm not, right? By certain measurements, I've been announced as a rhino or someone who just doesn't see these values. But, and I do appreciate using the word movement, because I think conservatism is an impulse. It's a disposition. It's a worldview, but it's also a movement. It has to have some political imports or applications. Otherwise, what are we talking about, right? It has, unlike, say, liberalism, conservatism is much bigger than politics, but it includes politics. It has to include that also. And I think that is a good place to start, maybe, is that what it's like is a very anchoring thing. I think it's something that consistently attempts to try to, to put it in the words of Christ Jesus, render unto Caesar's that which is Caesar's, and to God that which is God's. I think conservatism allows us, because it's not an ideological program trying to say, here is the correct solution at all times in all cases for all people, but instead is trying to pay attention to the slowly accrued wisdom from the ages, maybe through revelation, maybe through shared experience, and apply those faithfully. It naturally has with it a sort of humility that it essentially says, look, this is not our forever home, or this is at least not utopia. It's not capable of being utopia. How do we approach this humbly? How do we begin first with what's working, and not and here really I think is one of the animating. My friends on the left, a lot of them I think are virtuous people. I just think they pick the wrong virtues to push forward in politics. They are animated in a lot of ways, in my view, by justice. They look at the world and they see, here's what's wrong. How do we set this right? And that's not to say that a conservative is not interested in justice, but when it comes to politics, the conservative's first thought is not justice, it's gratitude. It's, here's what's right. How do we hang on to that? Now let's look at how we can address the things that are wrong. As Thomas Sowell put it, very brilliantly, that we don't need to explore the causes of poverty. The causes of poverty are very obvious. We're born into this world with nothing. The fact that any of us make it at all is kind of a miracle. The real question is, what creates wealth? Why are things going right? We ought to assume they're going to go wrong unless in absence of somebody working toward them. So let's be grateful for these good things that we have, and let's start there. Reform begins with gratitude, not with a sense of, here's what's wrong.
Okay. So if I were to take a stab at this, I would say that you would be in favor of compassionate conservatism in the mold of, say, Reagan, because he was a do unto your neighbor as you would do unto yourself kind of a believer or leader. Is that accurate?
As a millennial, the term compassionate conservatism has naturally a connection to me with George W. Bush when he had used the phrase. Now, if you're saying him in the mold of Reagan, I hope so. That's probably the closest to the president we've had, say, within living memory, that he was not perfect, but got closest to a political emulation, if you will, of these ideas. George W. Bush, when he said it, meant a great deal more about the government as a tool for doing good things. And he seemed to mean that as kind of different from, say, like a Bill Clinton Democratic approach, because oftentimes Democrats will talk about the same thing. His difference seemed to be that meant an alliance, if you will, with faith-based organizations, maybe a means of trying to bolster private organizations that did charitable work. I will acknowledge there is a role for that, but if that's essentially what we're anchoring, say, compassionate conservatism to, I would not call myself a compassionate conservatism, or rather conservative. There's a role for it, there's a place for it, and I'm fine to have the debate. But for the most part, I prefer we not think of the government as a thing that does good, but rather as sort of a mediated institution that allows for a level playing field, so that you and I can find a way of doing those good things.
Right. 4 sports and 10 acres or 4 square miles or something like that.
Yeah.
Stick to your knitting. Okay. So from your perspective then, this is a concept. Conservatism is a concept or a movement that you're trying to sell via your podcast. And I'm going to bring it up now. Saving Elephants. I saw it on your coffee cup. It's awesome.
Yeah.
And so your podcast and your blog both are Saving Elephants. Is that accurate?
Yes, sir.
Okay, cool. So now, from your perspective, you're trying to advertise, sell, create, bring about this movement to your contemporaries within the millennial and younger communities. How's that working out when you got a generation that the average age of a new homeowner is 38, and the generation in front of you did a wonderful job of near bankrupting our country?
I will. Wow, you're baiting me to a response on that one, but maybe we'll talk about the 2008 market collapse here in a moment. It's difficult. It is a difficult mode, and that is the motivation. That is the reason I am a millennial, and I focus mostly on millennials. Now, I'm more than happy to have a conversation with anyone, and I think anybody that listens to the podcast will see very quickly, oh, okay, this is a transgenerational project and message. The reason I'm focused on millennials, other than the fact that I just happen to be one, is our living memory of conservatism, if you will, is essentially those of us who are old enough being sort of a Newt Gingrich anti-Bill Clinton, kind of the Rush Limbaugh era, or George W. Bush, and then on in today, Donald Trump, who in a lot of ways, like him or love him, I think it's very fair to say Trump was a rejection of the Bush model. If I had to pick between the two, I am far more a Bush Republican than a Trump Republican, but that doesn't mean I was super pro George W. Bush. I mean, I say this very often, that at the early days of the Tea Party, which began under Barack Obama's the beginning of his administration, I began to know something very peculiar, which was, yes, there's a lot of anger here toward the government, but it's not exclusive to Obama. A lot of these people are really upset with the waning days of the Bush administration.
Yeah,
there was a perception, even among the right, that we were lied to about the wars, that the wars became a quagmire they weren't supposed to be. And then the whole thing ends with a 2008 market collapse. Here's this guy that, and it's not just all on Bush's shoulders, but I'll say that entire generation of what, in my view, is wrongly labeled neoconservatives. That's a broader term we can get into if we want to, but we'll just say for simplicity's sake, what would be called the neoconservative model was sort of discredited. So here I am as a millennial. I mentioned earlier, Reagan is my idea of not the perfect president, but who I prefer we went back to in the party. For most of my contemporaries, their living memory is, okay, we can either do a George W. Bush or Donald Trump. That's it. That's our choices. Yeah. Either we have someone railing against the establishment or the establishment itself. And I think part of what Saving Elephants is really trying to do is saying conservatism is a lot deeper than that. And there's a lot more to draw on. These are not our only options. And it's hard when you're in a generation that has no living memory of what an alternative would look like.
So as I age and I see my generation, broad scope, broad brush again, my generation, I see it. There's a deep division between us, and I really didn't notice it until they started getting close to retirement age, and then these people who were united in their thought processes and their shared experience went either wildly left or wildly right. And so you've got this group of people that's defined and segregated by CNN versus Fox News. And I don't know that there's any room for unity there. And I'm sitting in the middle of the rocking chair going, well, this is not about relationships are bigger than one it to be politically. How are you mending that? Coming behind us?
Some of this is going to change just because of generational differences. I think we have been, for lack of a better way to put it, stuck in a baby boomer model for 20, 30, 40 years maybe. And I don't necessarily all mean that all is a bad thing. I just mean if you simply look at the simple fact that, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Barack Obama are all born in the same, or Obama wasn't, but Trump were all born in the same year.
Yeah.
The degree to which boomer politics has had a hold, and in a lot of ways, is sort of the entire idea of the entitlement programs. There has been a broad consensus on the left and right. We've got to keep these things going. Just we might disagree with how to do it.
Yeah.
I think that's changing, and I don't know what the politics of the future necessarily looks like, but I do know there are a lot of ways in which, say, even we'll put it this way. Right-leaning individuals in the United States are far more open to environmental reforms if they're younger than older Americans. Left-leaning are far more open to talks about maybe the entitlement programs won't go on forever. Now, they might have different solutions, what that means. But I do think there's necessarily room for differences because our politics are going to change generationally. I don't think that means that it's all going to be kumbaya singing around the campfire, we're all getting along. I also think that there's a tendency, unfortunately, for social media to magnify the degree to which these very real, diametrically opposed camps truly represent Americans. To be frank, I run into a lot more people such as yourself than I do diehard MAGA or far leftist. Again, those people exist, but I don't think they represent the whole of the country. I think that there's a potential for coming together, if you will, for negotiations. I don't, and I know this is something that some might find very upsetting, but I'll just go ahead and say it. I find a lot of commonalities between both those groups you mentioned, the CNN and the Fox News watchers. Now, obviously, there are differences, important differences, but I think there's also really important similarities, and that they both have a relatively winner-take-all attitude as to how politics is supposed to work. And they both have, unfortunately, in my view, whether or not they would express in these terms, a fairly authoritarian understanding of what the solution to this problem is. That if somehow they could, and by they I mean either Trump or AOC, could just seize power and through executive fiat could bend the will of the people, then we would solve these issues. I think most Americans aren't in either of those camps, but the irony is that sort of those two camps, and there's a lot of ways in which the Republican Party is welcoming in more workers, if you will, is more worker friendly than what, that was the Democrats' base since from FDR up through the last, 60, 70 years.
Yeah.
I think there's some weird potentials for sort of Bernie Sanders MAGA America coalition that might sound insane right now, but in the very near future could happen.
Do you think that part of the reason for that is that the millennials are more civil with one another?
I'm sorry, I missed the last thing you said.
Do you believe that is perhaps because the millennials are capable of being more civil with one another?
I don't know. I think millennials are more capable of civility across the current technologies we have. It remains to be seen if we are as out of touch with technology, say like the rise of AI, once we get to be, say Gen X or even the baby boomers generation. Like, is this a human problem, or is this does it matter where you catch the technological wave, if you will?
Yeah.
I think my personal belief is we're just as capable of being vicious and uncivil, but it probably will look different. And my hope is that in that sort of slide to difference, we find a way to minimize the incivility and find a way to build back the civility.
One of the things that I'm finding out, especially with the Gen Zers, is they're saying, "Hey, put down your phone.
Yeah,
I don't want it anymore." And I find that less in the boomer generation and more in the millennials and then Gen Zs. The Gen Xers, I think, are kind of caught in the middle because they've got kids and starting to have grandkids that are communicating only via that. The Gen Ys or the Gen Xers, I mean, or Gen Zs. They're the first one that had that, and so the Encyclopedia Britannica and the World Book is gone forever.
Yeah.
and they won't even know what it was, but they've got all this information right at their fingertip, and in some ways they're rejecting it for relation building.
Yeah, it's a multi-generation problem, right? We're all stuck in this together, even though it's impacting each of us
Mhm.
a little differently. No, look, if you go back far enough, because I'm old enough, I sort of the advent of the internet, I do remember people talking about how this could be a bad thing, but from like a religious perspective, it was almost always more like, well, this is the mark of the beast. We're all going to be in a one world system sort of thing.
Yeah,
There was
yeah,
mostly
end times argument.
right in times argument, like a lot of it was sort of odd, kind of almost conspiratorial theories about why this is not good.
Mhm.
Um, and then even with social media, like at the beginning of it, honestly, Facebook was fun. I'm old enough to remember when it was just college students or near graduate. Like that's how you kept in touch with the people you used to know 2 years ago and hang out with all the time. But now, oh, look,
Yeah,
such and so just got a house, sort of thing. And it didn't quite dawn on us until a little bit later, like, oh, like the fact that I can connect to the entire world means the entire world can connect to me. And here's
yeah,
all the ways that could go right. And so the technology we have currently, it's, I've yet to meet the individual who says, where we went wrong as a species was when we invented indoor plumbing. If we could
yeah.
just go back to having a crap outdoors. There are a lot of technologies like, yeah, that's all good. It seems like we have reached across multiple generations sort of a consensus of, yes, these technologies are doing good and wonderful things in our life. Yes, they're going to make us more prosperous, certainly more efficient. There's all sorts of advantages, but there's also a high degree of cynicism. I mean, the
Mhm.
amount of people who just, as a joke, and sometimes I don't think it's quite a joke, talk about how AI might, in fact, kill the human species at some point, and creates a sort of Terminator doomsday scenario, is just not the way we were talking 20 or 30 years
We'll
ago.
just shut off the power.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think we're sort of, I find hope in this because I think we're more wide eyed about the destruction of the technology, but I think we're
Mhm.
also simultaneously, okay, so now what? Like, it's hard to just turn your phone off. I
Yeah.
have friends who talk about it's true that younger kids growing up, um, we know statistically that the fact that they have access to these smartphones is detrimental to them. However, what's also pernicious is in those groups, if you take away a smartphone from just one of them, sometimes it harms them even more because
Wow.
all of their friends are on smartphones. Now they have no one to talk to.
Yeah.
So it's hard to reverse engineer, but I take courage in the fact that we're all kind of open eyed about this and trying to think through, okay, what is a reasonable, cautious way we could implement these new technologies?
Yeah. It starts as a grandpa with the art of conversation.
Yeah.
And I've got this wonderful feature on my phone when I turn it upside down, it goes automatically goes DMD and or do not disturb. And I think that that is probably going to have to be the way of the future for people like me to be able to exercise the. I've got 18 grandkids, so I got to do it a lot. I got to put that phone down a
Wow.
lot,
Wow.
and that's a responsibility that I'm starting to take very seriously. To take these blocks of time that I have to say, hey, kids, I made goulash for lunch, and so I'm going to invite you all over, and we're going to have a grandpa. We call our plastic fork lunch because grandpa doesn't like eating dishes. But the net effect is that you got to put your phone down in order to accomplish that. And then you can go cross generationally. But speaking of that, I want to know. I've got to begin at some point. This is such a fun conversation. Got to begin to land this airplane. Um, who are the people who are shaping conservatives and conservative thought for your generation and beyond?
Well, if you go to savingelephantsblog.com, if you go to savingelephants.com, I think you'll find people trying to save actual elephants. But savingelephantsblog.com, one of what continues to be this day my most popular blog post is 50 conservative thinkers, where I literally list
Oh,
50
very cool.
individuals. Now, you asked more specifically about almost this day. There
Yeah.
are a few individuals who, for varying reasons, I would point in people to. One that springs to mind is Jonah Goldberg. He's not perfect in all regards, but he's really entertaining and he talks about current issues. And I think he's got his head screwed on straight.
Mhm.
And he's part of the Dispatch media. If you want to go a little bit more cerebral, you couldn't do better, in my opinion, than Yuval Levin. He is not to be confused with Mark Levin. Maybe they're related for all I know. But Yuval Levin is just a little bit older than I am. He's got a head that looks like it's worn out 2 or 3 bodies already. But the guy is he is not only brilliant, it's everything he said. I've had had the honor of having multiple conversations with him. Had him on my podcast a couple of times. He's written many books, and he thinks about really current issues, even though he has a strong grasp of the roots of intellectual movements.
Uh-huh.
And he has this very, I would say, almost peculiar respect for the left. He is definitely conservative, but
Mhm.
he is able to communicate in a means that expresses why those on the left, not all, but why the
Mhm.
left in general, don't mean us harm, where they could be coming from, in a manner that I think is both constructive and allows you to not hate someone, but to engage in their argument.
Mhm.
And there's, like I said, those are two of the 50. I could go on,
Yeah.
but those would be the top two I kind of think of.
Okay. So, in contemporary terms, one of the media figures that is having a dramatic impact from my perspective is Charlie Kirk as he approaches college campuses and tries to get people to actually stop and talk,
Hmm.
or stop and argue, or stop arguing and talk, or something like that. But is he having an impact on the conservative movement within groups that you see?
Yeah, that's a good question. I am always in awe at Charlie Kirk's reach, if you will, and impact and ability to generate um, controversies, if you will. I'm not a huge fan of Charlie Kirk for that reason. I think he is he's probably a very sincere person, but he tends to approach conservatism from more of a let's extract liberal tears than sort of a
Mm,
consensus building. Let's try to understand why conservatism has a value that even those on the left would benefit from.
mhm,
I don't by that mean I am blind to the fact that there are a good many people who do not argue in good faith. I mean, that is
yeah.
absolutely true. But something that I think conservatives would do well to remember, and again, if that I keep tooting my own horn here, that list of 50 individuals who are conservative thinkers, I think most people will be shocked how many of those people on that list that truly formed the conservative movement over the last 200 years, in their
Mhm,
early days, were hardcore Marxist Leninist or socialist or something just radical
mhm,
leftist. Some of the greatest conservative thinkers of all times came from the radical left.
yeah.
And I think that there are instances in which I won't say Charlie Kirk full stop, but I'll say that approach to the left writes them off as humans is almost unreachable.
Mhm,
Now, there's a way in which you can hold to your principles and argue with someone, uh, but I think it's needful to recognize when that is pinging the emotions more than the
yeah.
heart, if you will,
Yeah.
and certainly more than the intellect.
And I certainly think that as conservatives, as thoughtful conservatives, we ought not to have arguments. We ought to have conversations because the power of the idea is certainly stronger than the power of the emotion that backs it. Yeah.
Possibly. It depends on its application. Emotion is very powerful.
Hmm.
The problem with emotion is it is exhaustible a lot faster. The problem with the intellect, though, is we're not, I think the best way to express it, we're not rational beings, we are rationalizing beings.
Mhm.
And we actually come to most of our ideas not just because we sat down and thought about it one day, but through the relationships we've generated. And so I absolutely agree with you that conversation is preferred over argument. But I would say the means of conversation is not just intellectual; it's also trying to reach a person's heart. Where are
Mhm.
they at, and what appeals to them,
Right.
before a person would ever be open to an argument. And the frustration there is, I think we ought to remember that sometimes maybe our role in this world is not to convince someone of our viewpoint entirely, but just to let's put a pebble in their shoe. Let's give them
Hmm.
something that maybe directs them a little bit closer. First we need to make sure we're right because we're fallible and we can cause, we could be wrong.
Yeah.
But we're not trying to convert everyone to this exact model of thinking. It's more just trying
For
to open
sure.
up the possibilities that maybe the truth is broader than what you're considering.
Yeah. And not only that, when we bring forward a, a claim of being correct, you are so spot on. Let's make sure we're correct. And a
Mm,
lot of times that involves, and whether you call it conversation or argument, it's relevant dialogue. Let's sit down together and let's chew on these things and tear them apart. And that is part of. I mean, if you go back even to the founding fathers, I mean, there were some of those guys who were ready to pound on one another, but they didn't.
yeah.
And what a lesson because you had your Federalists on one, on one, and these guys were adamant. One wanted, 100% states right. The other one, the other side wanted to have a strong central government. But wait a minute, and it kind of
Yeah,
reminds me of what's going on today.
if you think social media political discourse is bad today, just read the things that were said in the newspapers. When George Washington and John Adams were president, I mean, those people were vicious.
All right, so we have a bit gone off the rails in terms of our conservatism. What's the best path back?
The best path to get back on the rails, you mean? That is an excellent question. And I don't have like a 5-point plan. Here's how we do that. And even if I did, who's going to listen to me, right?
I am.
Well, I appreciate that. But I mean, I recognize I'm not exactly in the driver's seat of where the broader right is going these days. I think that the challenge for today is honestly the same the challenge has always been. It is needful that conservatives remember that the modern American conservative movement is remarkably new. Like, we had a predominantly progressive coalition, dominant coalition from FDR for generations. And it really wasn't until the 1950s that there even began to be a conservative movement, very, very tiny. Russell Kirk in his I think it was 52 or 53, I can't remember, when he wrote The Conservative Mind. The argument there, a very wonderful book. I would highly recommend if anybody wants to. It's dense, and foreboding, but there's a lot of nuggets in there. And what is it essentially trying to argue is that it was not just a liberal tradition with the United States. There's actually a conservative tradition also, and has been a conservative thread through the beginning of the nation up through today. And that was really the first attempt to try to argue that. And then slowly you begin to, with William F. Buckley and Frank Meyer, some others, they begin to build the movement. And they were out of power, like completely out of power. LBJ, when you get to him, he had commanding majorities in Congress. He had a mandate. And if today we sling this term around mandate all the time, as if somebody can just get 50% of the vote plus one, somehow they've got a mandate from people. LBJ had arguably a more commanding mandate than than any other president. And conservatives were really on the back foot. Goldwater had lost in one of the most lopsided defeats in history. Reagan lost repeatedly when he tried to run for president in the Republican coalition. Buckley lost when he ran for mayor. It was almost he had that famous line that asked him, "What will you do, sir, if you win?" And he says, "I will demand a recount." Kind of this notion of who could possibly believe I'm going to win this thing.
Nobody's going to win that.
Right. But slowly, over multiple generations of trying to essentially tell America these abiding truths, the American people themselves said, you know what, we're tired of runaway inflation. We're tired of an open question, are we going to lose the Cold War? We're tired of being told as Americans we should almost be ashamed of ourselves and our history.
Yeah.
And those individuals who had been consistently for years never knowing if they were going to be transcendent, sharing these messages and these truths, all of a sudden the American people started to say, hey, this makes a lot of sense. Yeah. And so I think for me, it's less about here's exactly what to do. And it's more a recognition that sooner or later people are tired of government that doesn't work. And as I said earlier, I could be wrong. But if I'm not wrong, eventually I think people will come around to saying maybe limited government is a better model. Maybe less state control is a better model. Maybe less concern with culture war and more concern with like the actual moral formation of the individuals is a better model. And so long as there are brave men and women willing to articulate and share that message consistently, I think eventually it does get a fair hearing, and eventually others will turn to it and say, let's give this a go.
Yeah. And so it's going to take a considerate populace. And by considerate, I mean people who are going to take the time to listen, to analyze, and to make good decisions, do the right thing. So, Josh, I just want to say thank you, man, for coming on and savingelegance.blog.com.
Yes, sir.
Right? Okay, we'll put that in the show notes. Just like everybody else who comes on, this is Grandpa Chats with Champions. And I have you as a champion, sir, for sticking up for what you believe for your generation and those that follow. But there's someone in your life who's impacted you in such a meaningful way that has changed your journey and affected you that you would give them a tip of the cap and say thank you to them? Who would that be in your life?
The problem is just trying to pick one person. There have been
I've
so
heard
many.
that before.
Yeah, and maybe this is cheating, and it might be reaching for low hanging fruit. But I'm going to say my parents, mom and dad, together, wonderful people. They were always very humble individuals who don't share my politics, if you will. But I think they share the beginning of my sentiments of what I would hope to be of humility, of a genuine sincerity, of a genuine desire that their politics would be such that it would allow them to be good neighbors and good citizens, and not a commitment to some ideological framework that just says, hey, so long as we trust in these, say, governmental programs, all will be well. And I think that sort of common sense, they just worked hard and they basically behaved themselves as extremely decent Americans.
Yeah.
I think that is often undersold, the true impact that it has, that we often look for an individual who's done some great, wonderful thing.
Yeah.
And to be fair, that is a great, wonderful thing, right? To actually live this life with integrity. How many can say that?
That's awesome. What's their first names?
Steve and Tammy.
Steve and Tammy, we want to say thank you from the grid. So any closing comments, buddy?
I don't know that I found a good way to answer that question. No, I hope my life, just like my politics, emits gratitude because much has been given to me. I know that as scripture says, much is expected of those who have received much. So I hope I can give back.
Well, Josh, let me tell you, you represent the millennials very well. So thank you for that. And Grampion Nation, there is an opportunity for you to start living those Grampion-sized dreams. Thanks for stopping by. This is Jim.
When you get an opportunity, subscribe or follow wherever you get your podcast.